The leather saddlebag hit the sheriff's desk with a sound like a judge's gavel, and every ounce of color drained from Roscoe Ellsworth's face the moment he saw what tumbled out of it. Annie Vaughn stood across from him, her dark hair wind-tangled, her dress torn at the hem from hard riding, and her brown eyes burning with something that walked the razor's edge between terror and fury. She had ridden 40 miles through the night to get here. She had done it alone, without a lantern, without a weapon beyond the small folding knife she kept tucked inside her left boot. She had done it because every single door in Caldwell Springs had been slammed shut in her face, and she needed one person in this world to look at what she had found and tell her she was not losing her mind. What lay scattered across Roscoe's desk was not a map. It was not a letter. It was not contraband whiskey or stolen gold certificates, though those things would have been alarming enough. What Annie had found inside that saddlebag was a ledger, hand-stitched and worn at the corners, filled with names. Names she recognized: the mayor of Caldwell Springs, the postmaster, 3 members of the town council, the banker, the circuit judge who passed through every third Tuesday. And beside each name, in a cramped, careful hand, were numbers, dates, transaction amounts, and the unmistakable seal of the man everyone in this part of Kansas called Boss Delman, a man who was supposed to be dead and buried in the county cemetery with a proper headstone and 6 feet of prairie dirt over his chest. Roscoe had not moved. He had not spoken. His jaw was tight enough to crack a walnut, and his gray eyes moved over each page with the slow, controlled focus of a man trying very hard not to let anyone see that the floor had just dropped out from beneath him. "How long have you had this?" he asked at last, his voice low and careful, the way a man speaks when he is standing near something explosive. "Since yesterday morning," Annie said. "About 4 hours after I found it, I went to tell Mayor Hutchins. He shut the door in my face. I went to Reverend Poole, same thing. I went to Mr. Farris at the general store, who I have known since I was 12 years old, and he looked at me through the window glass and turned away without opening the latch. Every door. Every single door in that town." Roscoe looked up at her then, and for the first time since she had walked into his office, she saw the thing beneath his control. It was not just official concern. It was personal. She just did not know yet why. She had known Roscoe Ellsworth the way most people in a spread-out Kansas county came to know their sheriff, which was to say she knew his reputation before she knew his face. He was 32 years old, broad in the shoulders, economical with words, and generally regarded as the kind of lawman who did not bend. She had met him once in passing at the Caldwell Springs Harvest Fair 2 autumns ago, and they had exchanged perhaps 3 sentences. She had thought then that he had honest eyes. She still thought so now, standing in his office at 2 in the morning with her hands trembling, and her heart hammering so loud she could feel it in her back teeth. She had not expected to feel the pull of him even now, even in the middle of all this fear. But the pull was there, steady as gravity, and she resented it a little because she could not afford it just yet. To understand how Annie Vaughn had ended up in this moment, you had to go back 3 weeks, to the day she arrived in Caldwell Springs with a single trunk, a letter of introduction, and the particular determination of a woman who has decided that 26 is not too old to start over somewhere new. She had come from Wichita, where she had spent 4 years working as a school teacher, and 1 miserable year recovering from an engagement broken off by a man who turned out to care more about her father's property than about her. Her father, James Vaughn, had died of a fever the previous winter, leaving her the house and a small sum of money that felt enormous when she first received it, and then shrank at alarming speed as she sat in Wichita trying to figure out what to do with the rest of her life. A friend had written to tell her about Caldwell Springs, a growing town of roughly 800 people on the southern edge of Sumner County, Kansas. There was a school there, her friend said. The previous schoolteacher had married a cattle rancher in April and moved 20 miles west, and the town board was looking for a replacement. The wages were modest, but the house that came with the position was solid, and the land around it was beautiful if you had the kind of eyes that could appreciate flat open space. Annie had those eyes. She had always loved the prairie, that enormous, breathing, indifferent flatness that some people found lonely and she found honest. It did not pretend to be anything other than what it was. She had packed her trunk, said goodbye to her friend, and boarded the stage south. She arrived on a Wednesday in late September of 1883, and her first impression of Caldwell Springs was that it had the solid, purposeful look of a town that had decided to stay. There was a proper main street with a hardware store, a hotel, a bank, a post office, a barber shop, and 2 saloons. There was a church with a white painted steeple that you could see from 2 miles out. There was a schoolhouse at the east end of town with new glass in the windows and a bell that someone kept polished. And there were people everywhere, ranchers and merchants and families and cowboys passing through, all of them going about their business with the unsentimental efficiency of people who had work to do and intended to do it. She had been met at the stage by a man named Aldous Barrick, who was on the town board and who had, she gathered, been responsible for hiring her. He was a compact, watchful man in his mid-50s with close-set eyes and a handshake that lasted a half-second too long. She had smiled and followed him to the schoolteacher's house, which was exactly as described, solid and clean, with a small front porch and a kitchen that got good morning light. She had felt the particular relief of a woman who had made a decision and found it to be, at least on the surface, the right one. Her first 2 weeks in Caldwell Springs were unremarkable in the best possible way. She opened the school. The children came, 23 of them ranging from age 6 to 15, and they were a decent collection of ordinary youngsters, some smart and sharp, some quiet and careful, all of them sizing her up with the frank assessment of children who have had more than one teacher in a year and know that not all of them stay. She set them to work on their letters and their arithmetic and their geography, and by the end of the first week, she could already tell which ones were going to surprise her and which ones were going to require infinite patience. She learned the town in the slow way you learn a place when you are living in it rather than just passing through. She learned that the best coffee was at the hotel and the best bread was at the Farris General Store, where old Mr. Farris baked in the early morning and sold from noon. She learned that there were 2 factions in the town council, and that they had been arguing about water rights for 3 years. She learned that there was a man everyone called Boss Delman who had built a cattle operation north of town in the late 1870s and had died, as far as anyone knew, of a heart ailment in the spring of 1882. His operation had been taken over by his business partner, a man named Chester Crail, who still ran cattle on the same land and had offices in town. She did not think much about Boss Delman until the Saddlebag. It was a Thursday morning, her 18th day in Caldwell Springs. She had risen early to prepare her lessons, and after breakfast she walked the long way to the schoolhouse, which took her along the back edge of town, where the smaller houses gave way to a stretch of open land that people used as a kind of informal common. It was cool, the first real bite of autumn in the air, and the sky was the deep Pacific blue you only get in October on the southern plains. She found the horse at the edge of the common, standing quietly near a low scrub oak, reins dragging. It was a bay gelding, well-made and well-kept, wearing a good saddle with silver hardware that caught the morning light. There was no rider anywhere in sight. The horse looked at her with calm dark eyes and did not move when she approached and took hold of the trailing reins. She waited a few minutes, looking around, calling out in case a rider had simply stepped away for a moment. No one came. The horse was not injured and did not seem distressed, but the saddle was damp with a night's dew, which suggested it had been standing there for hours. She tied the reins loosely around the scrub oak and was about to go find someone in authority when she noticed the saddlebag was partially open, and something was working its way free of it with each small shift of the horse's weight. She reached in to tuck it back and felt the hard edge of the ledger. She should not have looked at it. That was the thing that would occur to her later, lying awake in the dark. If she had simply tucked it back in and gone straight to the town marshal, or left it entirely and sent one of her older students to find the horse's owner, none of what followed would have happened the way it did. But she was a teacher, and teachers read things. It was not a virtue exactly. It was a condition. She opened the ledger and read, standing in the morning light with the bay gelding breathing quietly beside her. And by the second page she knew she was holding something that was going to rearrange the shape of her life, whether she liked it or not. She recognized the handwriting. It was not a thing she could have explained easily, but she had been reading children's handwriting every day for 4 years, learning to identify the individual personality in the way a person formed their letters, and the handwriting in this ledger had a particular cramped, leftward-leaning style that she had seen before. She had seen it on a document posted on the board at the post office, an official-looking notice about water usage regulations, signed by the office of Chester Crail. The ledger was not a simple accounting book. It was a record of payments, bribes in all but name, made systematically to most of the people who held any kind of authority in Caldwell Springs. The mayor, the postmaster, the circuit judge, the town council members, the bank manager. All of them on a regular schedule, all of them receiving what the ledger called cooperation remuneration, and all of it flowing from a fund identified only by the initials BD, which was not difficult to interpret when you lived in a town where everyone knew the name Boss Delman, and when the dates in the ledger ran from 1879 all the way to the present month, which meant that the man whose name was on these pages was not dead at all. The horse was Chester Crail's horse. She realized this about an hour later when she was back in her house with the ledger on her kitchen table and the door locked, because she had seen Chester Crail ride that horse down Main Street twice in the 2 weeks she had been in town, and that particular horse with those particular silver saddle fittings was hard to mistake. She did not know where Crail was, or why his horse had been standing on the common with an open saddlebag in the early morning, but she could construct possibilities, none of them comfortable. She spent the morning trying to decide what to do. The logical thing was to take it to authority. But the ledger was a map of authority in Caldwell Springs, and nearly every name on it was a name with authority. The town marshal was a man named Griffith, appointed by the mayor and the town council, which meant he reported to people who were on the list. She did not know enough about him to trust him. She did not know enough about anyone in this town to trust them, not yet. By afternoon, she had made her decision. She would try the most obvious routes first, partly because she needed to see what happened, and partly because if she went straight to an outside authority without having tried the local ones, someone would later argue she had overreacted or jumped to conclusions. She went to Mayor Hutchins first. The mayor's house was a large, white-painted frame structure on the north side of Main Street. She knocked. She heard movement inside. She waited. She knocked again. The curtain in the front window moved and she caught a brief glimpse of a face before it was quickly withdrawn. She waited another full minute. The door did not open. She told herself there was an innocent explanation. She went to Reverend Poole. The Reverend was not at the church. His housekeeper answered the door of the adjacent residence, looked at Annie with an expression of flat unease, and said the Reverend was not available. When Annie said it was urgent, the housekeeper shut the door without a further word. She went to Mr. Farris, who she had been buying bread from every other morning, and who had seemed, in those brief daily transactions, to be a decent and straightforward man. He saw her through the glass of the general store window and turned away from her. She watched him walk to the back of the store and disappear into a storeroom, and she stood on the boardwalk outside for a full 60 seconds feeling the cold realization settle over her that the town already knew what she had found, and that the town had collectively decided to pretend she did not exist until she went away or put it back. She went home. She fed the bay gelding which she had tied to her fence post, water and some grain she found in a neighbor's barn. She packed a small bag. She waited for full dark. And then she saddled the neighbor's old roan mare, which said neighbor kept in a small paddock behind her house, and which Annie had asked once if she might borrow sometime for exercise, and she rode north toward Garfield County, where the county seat was, where there was a county sheriff's office, and where the sheriff was a man named Roscoe Ellsworth, who had not been on any list she had read. She arrived at 2 in the morning. The office was lit, which surprised her until she considered that a sheriff's office in a working county on the Kansas frontier was often lit at odd hours because trouble did not observe business hours. She had tied the roan out front, walked in without knocking, set the saddlebag on the desk and said without preamble, "I need you to look at this." He had looked at it. He was still looking at it now, turning pages with careful hands, and the expression on his face had moved through several stages. The official neutrality he had started with, then a sharp and immediate alertness, then something that looked, briefly, like recognition, and then a very controlled stillness that she was beginning to understand was what Roscoe Ellsworth looked like when he was extremely concerned. "Tell me where you found it," he said, not looking up. She told him. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. She had spent the last 20 hours being either ignored or shut out, and having someone actually listen to her felt startlingly good, even if that someone was only doing it because it was his professional obligation. When she finished, he turned back to the first page of the ledger and then said, quietly, "Chester Crail. You know him. I know of him." Roscoe set the ledger down and looked at her directly, and she noticed again that he had the particular quality of certain people in positions of responsibility, a way of giving you their full attention that felt both professionally impersonal and genuinely human at the same time. "Miss Vaughn, I want to ask you something straight and I need a straight answer." "All right. Did anyone see you ride out of Caldwell Springs?" She thought about it. "I don't think so. I left after dark. I went out the back way." He nodded and she could see him running calculations. "All right, you're going to stay here tonight. I have a room above the office that I use when I need to keep someone safe, and right now that is what you are, someone who needs to be kept safe. I need to be back for my students in the morning. Your students will have a day without school." He said it without harshness, but with a finality that told her arguing was going to be unproductive. "This ledger is significant evidence. It's also, if these names are who I think they are, a very dangerous thing to have been carrying around for a day and a half." "I'm aware of that," she said. "That's why I rode through the night to bring it to someone who might actually help." Something shifted in his expression then, something quick and almost imperceptible, like a door opening a half-inch in a windstorm. He looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded once, and she understood that he had heard what she had not quite said, that she had trusted him specifically, that she had chosen his door out of all the doors in the world to knock on, and that he was not taking that lightly. "I'll make coffee," he said. She sat across from him at the plain wooden desk while the stove heated, and he asked her to walk through everything again slowly, while he wrote notes in a small bound book he kept in his desk drawer. She told him everything, beginning with finding the horse on the common and ending with the roan mare tied out front. He wrote steadily and asked good questions, the kind that filled in gaps without leading her anywhere, and she found herself relaxing in degrees, the way you do when the person listening to you is genuinely capable. He was not what she had expected, though she could not have said exactly what she had expected. He was quieter than she had imagined, with less of the swagger that sometimes came with a badge and a reputation. He was careful. He chose his words the way a careful man chooses a path across uncertain ground, each one placed with intention. He had a scar along his left jawline, old and white, that she found herself looking at occasionally and then looking away from. He smelled of coffee and leather, and the particular outdoors smell of a man who spends a great deal of his life on horseback. "Can I ask you something?" she said, when they had been talking for perhaps an hour and he had set down his pen and was studying the ledger again. "You can ask." You said you recognized something in this ledger. When you first looked at it, before you said anything, your face changed. What did you recognize?" He was quiet for a moment. The stove ticked. Outside, a night bird made a single sound and went silent. "There are things I'm not able to tell you yet," he said. "Not because I don't trust you, because until I know exactly what I'm working with, I can't risk spreading information before I know where it might land." That's a careful answer. "It's the only honest one I have right now." She nodded. She could accept that. It was, at least, an honest acknowledgement of limitation rather than a dismissal. She respected it. He showed her the room above the office. It was small and spare, with a narrow bed and a washstand and a window that looked out over the dark street below. He gave her a bar of soap and a clean towel that had the rough institutional quality of linens purchased in bulk, and he said there would be hot water in the morning. She thanked him. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and she thought he was about to say something else, but then he only said, "Lock this door," and went back down. She locked the door. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at her hands, which had finally stopped shaking, and listened to the sounds from below, the creak of his chair, the occasional soft step across the floorboards, the distant sound of him pouring water. She was not afraid, exactly. She was in the particular state of high alertness that comes after fear has passed its peak, where everything feels very clear and very real, and you are aware of each sensation with a kind of luminous precision. She was aware of how tired she was. She was aware of the rough texture of the quilt under her hands. She was aware, with a distinct and slightly uncomfortable clarity, that the man downstairs had very honest gray eyes and that she had been noticing them probably more than the situation strictly required. She told herself that was just the effect of extreme circumstances, which made people vivid to each other in ways that normal life did not. She believed this, more or less. She lay down on the narrow bed without undressing, folded her hands on her stomach, and fell asleep inside of 3 minutes. Downstairs, Roscoe Ellsworth did not sleep at all. He sat at his desk with the ledger open in front of him and the lamp turned low, and worked through the problem the way he had learned to work through hard problems, methodically, from the outside in, looking at each piece before he tried to make them fit together. The ledger confirmed things he had suspected for 2 years. Things he had been building a case around quietly, carefully, without telling anyone in Caldwell Springs, and without involving the Caldwell Springs authorities, because those authorities were, as it now turned out, exactly as compromised as he had feared. He had suspected corruption in the Caldwell Springs power structure, since a cattleman named Roy Purdy had come to him 18 months ago, badly frightened, claiming that he had been pressured into selling land adjacent to the Delman operation under threat that was never stated outright but was entirely clear. Purdy had recanted 2 weeks later, said he had been confused, said everything was fine, and then moved his family to Colorado without further explanation. Roscoe had started looking into Boss Delman quietly after that. What he found was a man who had built an empire in the decade after the Civil War by being simultaneously charming and ruthless, by bribing the people who needed bribing and crushing the people who wouldn't take bribes, and by operating with the patience of someone who understood that the best kind of control was the kind no one could see clearly enough to name. He had found evidence of the bribery, but evidence spread thin and kept where he could not reach it. He had found the death certificate for Delman, filed in the spring of 1882, and he had not believed it from the moment he read it, because the witness signatures on it were the signature of the county physician and the signature of Chester Crail, who was Delman's business partner and the man who stood to inherit everything if Delman died, which was a neat and suspicious arrangement. He had written to the county attorney twice. The county attorney, who was not on the ledger as far as Roscoe could tell, but who was cautious and methodical, and had the instinct of a man who moves slowly, had told him that circumstantial doubt about a death certificate was not actionable without additional evidence. The ledger was additional evidence. The ledger was, in fact, the kind of evidence that changed everything. It was the document that made the circumstantial concrete, that put names to the corruption and dates to the transactions and amounts to the bribes, and that demonstrated with the clear-eyed brutality of a well-kept record that Boss Delman had not died in 1882, and that his operation was still running, still paying, still reaching, still controlling the town of Caldwell Springs from behind the fiction of Chester Crale's management. He needed to move fast. If Crale had lost the ledger yesterday morning, he had had nearly 36 hours to realize it was gone. That was more than enough time to panic. And panicking men with access to resources and corrupt authority were unpredictable in ways that concerned him. He looked at the ceiling, where Annie Vaughn was sleeping in the spare room, and felt something that was not strictly professional concern. He had told himself, since his wife Clara had died 4 years ago of the fever that passed through the county in the winter of 1879, that he was not a man who had space in his life for that kind of feeling anymore. He had been wrong about that in the way you are sometimes wrong about the things you tell yourself in grief. He knew he was wrong about it. He had just not expected to be confronted with the evidence of his wrongness at 2 in the morning by a woman with wind-tangled hair and terrified, furious brown eyes who had trusted him when every other door was shut, and who was now asleep upstairs in the spare room, and for whose safety he felt a protectiveness that went somewhat beyond the requirements of his badge. He put that aside. He was good at putting things aside when there was work to do. He pulled out paper and began to write. By the time the sky went gray in the east, he had written 3 letters. One to the county attorney, Walter Baines in Caldwell. One to the United States Marshal's office in Wichita, which had jurisdiction over matters of federal corruption, and could move without being subject to the local authority structure that Delman had bought. One to a federal judge he had met 2 years ago at a law enforcement conference in Topeka, a man named Horatio Clement, who had a reputation for both integrity and speed. He sent all 3 letters with his deputy, a young man named Tom Farley who arrived at 7 in the morning, reliable and incurious and discreet in the way that good deputies often are. He sent Tom with instructions to ride fast and say nothing about where he was going to anyone who asked. Then he made more coffee and waited for Annie Vaughn to come downstairs. She came down at 7:30, with her hair pinned back neatly and her face composed in the particular way of a person who has decided that they are going to be calm regardless of what the morning requires. She looked at the lamp on his desk, which was still burning from the previous night, and at the dark circles under his eyes, and she said, "You didn't sleep." "No. Did you find something else in the ledger?" "I confirmed something I already suspected." He told her then, all of it. He had decided sometime in the gray hours before dawn that she had earned the truth. She had ridden 40 miles through the dark for it. The least he could do was give it to her. He told her about Roy Purdy and the land pressure, about his 2 years of quiet investigation, about the death certificate he had never believed, about the letters he had sent that morning. He watched her face as he spoke, and he saw the kind of intelligence that processes information with the whole mind, making connections quickly, filling in implications without prompting. "So Chester Crale is Boss Delman," she said when he had finished. "I believe so. Or Delman is running everything through Crale as a front. Either way, the operation is intact and the death was staged. And the people of Caldwell Springs who are on that list know he's alive and are being paid to keep up the fiction. That's what the ledger suggests." She was quiet for a moment, and he watched her think. There was something particularly compelling about watching someone with a real mind encounter a real problem. She did not perform distress or try to smooth the sharp edges of the situation into something more comfortable. She just thought, "What happens to me in all this?" She asked, not with fear but with the practical directness of someone who needs to understand their position. "You're a material witness. When this goes to a federal prosecution, and it will, you'll be asked to testify about finding the ledger. The chain of evidence, where and when and how, that matters." "I can do that." "I know you can." He said it without thinking, quickly, and there was a certainty in it that he had not planned, that had simply arrived from somewhere and come out of his mouth. She looked at him for a moment, and he saw something in her expression that was not quite surprise and not quite pleasure, something quieter and more careful than either of those things. "You're going to need to stay here," he said, back to the practical, "until I know the situation in Caldwell Springs is safe enough for you to return. That means your students are going to have a delay." "How long?" "I don't know yet. I hope not more than a week." She absorbed this. "I'll need to send word. There will be families worried." "I can have someone send word. I'll say there's been a family matter requiring your temporary absence." That's a polite way to describe it. Most useful euphemisms are. She smiled at that briefly, a small quick thing that changed her whole face in a way that did several things to him simultaneously, none of which he addressed. The days that followed were a particular kind of suspended time that Roscoe would think about afterward with a complex mixture of anxiety and an emotion he could not immediately name. Annie stayed in the spare room above the office. She was not idle. She asked him for paper and a primer and spent her mornings writing detailed lesson plans, which she said she would need anyway for when she returned. She read everything he had in the office that was worth reading, which included 2 legal reference volumes, a collected essays by Abraham Lincoln that someone had left behind, and a well-worn copy of Great Expectations that had belonged to his wife. He found her reading the Dickens on the second evening and said nothing about where it had come from, only that she was welcome to finish it. In the evenings, they talked. This was the thing he had not anticipated. He had anticipated the logistics, the letters and the weight and the professional necessity of keeping a material witness safe. He had not anticipated what it would be like to talk to someone who talked the way she did, with that particular combination of sharpness and warmth, who asked questions that were never quite what he expected, and who listened to his answers with the kind of attention that made you want to be worth it. She asked him about the law, how it worked in practice out here on the frontier where the official structure and the actual power structure were frequently different animals. He told her more than he usually said on the subject, because she engaged with it seriously, and because talking to someone who took the complexity seriously was different from the conversations he usually had, which tended toward the operational and the practical, and left the philosophical dimensions in the margins. She told him about Wichita, about the 4 years of teaching there, and what it was like to try to run a classroom in a city that was still working out whether it was a cow town or a proper city, and had not yet entirely decided. She told him about her father, without sentimentality, but with a clear and unguarded grief that she seemed comfortable allowing herself, and he found that he liked this about her very much, that she was not performing fine when she was not entirely fine. He did not tell her about Clara, not yet. He was not sure why, except that it felt like a thing that required a different moment than the ones they were having, which were good moments but were also still operating under the weight of the practical situation. On the third day, a telegram came from the U.S. Marshal's office in Wichita, and it changed the shape of everything. The telegram was brief but decisive. The Marshal had been investigating Chester Crail independently for 6 months on a separate matter involving fraudulent land claims filed in multiple counties across southern Kansas. The matter was further along than Roscoe had known. The ledger, which he had described in summary in his letter, was exactly the corroborating evidence they needed to bring the case to federal prosecution. A deputy marshal and a federal prosecutor were being dispatched from Wichita and would arrive within 4 days. In the meantime, Roscoe was instructed to secure the ledger and the witness, and to take no overt action that would alert Crail or his associates. He brought the telegram upstairs to where Annie was reading, and he watched her read it twice. He watched the relief move through her face, and then the awareness of what it meant, and then something else, something slightly harder to categorize. 4 days, she said. 4 days. And then it goes to the federal authorities and out of our hands. Out of the immediate danger, he said. You'll still need to testify, but the danger part, yes, out of that. She nodded. She set the telegram down on the small table by the window and looked out at the street below, and he looked at her profile, the particular angle of her jaw and the way she held her shoulders when she was thinking about something large. "What happens to Caldwell Springs?" she asked. "To the people in it. The ones who aren't on that ledger." He sat down in the chair by the door, because the answer required thought, and he thought better when he was not standing. "The town will have to rebuild its authority structure. The mayor, the council members who took bribes, the banker, they'll be removed or they'll resign. There will be trials, some of them. The town will be disrupted, but it will survive. Towns like Caldwell Springs survive things." "I chose it," she said, almost to herself. "I chose it because I wanted somewhere that felt real and solid, and it turns out the foundation was hollow. The foundation of the authority was hollow. The town itself, the people who aren't on that list, the ranchers and farmers and children in your classroom, they were real. They just didn't know what was happening under them." She turned to look at him then, and the late afternoon light through the window was very kind to her, and he thought, with a specific and careful clarity, that he was in a great deal of trouble of a kind that he did not entirely mind. "Do you like it?" she asked. "Your work?" "I do," he said. "Most of the time." "What's the part you don't like?" He thought about it honestly. "The gap between what should happen and what you can make happen. The cases where you know what the truth is and you can't build a bridge from knowing to proving. It gets easier when you've been at it long enough, accepting that gap, but it never entirely becomes comfortable." "That's like teaching," she said. "Knowing what a child is capable of and not being able to close the distance between what they are and what they could be fast enough. You just have to trust the process and keep showing up." "Yes," he said. "Exactly like that." They looked at each other for a moment, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that has weight in a good way, the kind that means there is too much to say to rush any of it. That was the moment, he thought afterward, when things shifted from what they had been to something else. Something without a name yet, but distinct. The following day brought trouble, as following days in uncertain situations tend to do. It came in the form of two men who rode into Garfield County's small Main Street at mid-morning, and tied their horses in front of the general store and went inside, and who Roscoe recognized from a distance as men who had been associated with Chester Crail's operation in the South. He had seen them once at a cattle auction, standing in Crail's shadow with the particular watchful stillness of men who are paid to watch. Their names were Fuller and Bix. He did not know their first names. He did not know their precise function, only that they were the kind of men who have a function, and that their function was not cordial. He went upstairs and told Annie to stay away from the windows. "They followed me," she said, and her voice was controlled but her eyes were not. "I don't know, possibly. Possibly they're just canvassing towns in the area looking for the ledger. If Crail lost it off his horse and doesn't know where it went, he'd be looking." He thought for a moment. "Did anyone see you leave Caldwell Springs?" she thought. "Mrs. Griggs lives next to where I borrowed the roan. She might have seen me take the horse. I don't know if she saw which direction I rode. If she reported it to anyone, they'd know you left going north. That narrows it." He watched them from the window of his office, moving casually but systematically. They visited the general store, came out, visited the barber shop, came out, stood talking in the street for a few minutes. They did not come to the sheriff's office, but that was not necessarily reassuring. Men like Fuller and Bix did not always approach problems directly. He sent a message to his deputy Tom, who was back by now, to watch them and follow at a careful distance without making it obvious. Tom was good at that. He had the unremarkable face of someone easily overlooked. Annie came downstairs in the afternoon, which he had not told her not to do, and she stood at the side of the window looking out at the street with her arms crossed and her expression very still. "I hate waiting," she said. "I know. I've been waiting for 3 days and I'm going to be waiting 3 more. That's not a complaint. I understand the necessity. I just want you to know it's something I'm actively working against." "What are you doing instead in your head?" She looked at him sideways. "Preparing every lesson I intend to teach from now until Christmas." "Is that enough?" "No," she admitted. "I'm also thinking about the ledger." about what it means that a man built an entire kingdom of complicity in a town of 800 people, and nobody broke the arrangement for 5 years. What does that say about how people make choices when the stakes are their own comfort and security versus someone else's justice? He had thought about this too. It says that most people are not cowards or villains, just practical. If someone pays you to look the other way and the cost of looking is manageable, and the cost of not looking seems terrifyingly high, most people will look away. It doesn't make it right. It makes it human. You don't look away, she said. I don't know you well enough to say that with certainty, but I'm fairly certain it's true. I have my own practical compromises, he said. Everyone does. Name one. He was quiet a moment. I knew for 2 years that something was wrong in Caldwell Springs, and I moved slowly because I didn't have the evidence to move fast. People might have been harmed in those 2 years that faster action might have prevented. I tell myself I was being careful and methodical, which is true. But careful and methodical is also sometimes a practical compromise with the part of you that is afraid of being wrong. She was quiet for a moment, considering this. That's honest. You asked for honest. I did. She paused. I think the difference between you and the men on that list is not that you're above practical compromise. It's that yours don't involve taking money to ignore other people's suffering. He looked at her directly. That's a generous reading. It's an accurate one. She turned from the window. Are those men still out there? I'll check. He looked. They're gone. That doesn't mean far. Tom came back at dusk with a report. Fuller and Bix had asked at the general store about a woman traveling alone from the south, describing someone who could have been Annie, though the description was generic enough to be any number of women. The general store keeper, who had no reason to lie and no connection to Caldwell Springs, had said he hadn't seen anyone matching that description. They had ridden out going south, which was either genuine departure or misdirection. Tom had followed them to the county line and confirmed they kept going south, but Roscoe did not let himself relax entirely. Men like that came back. That evening he told Annie about the report, and she received it with the steady practicality she had shown throughout, which he was coming to understand was not an absence of feeling but a discipline of it. She felt things intensely and managed them with intention. He found this deeply admirable and, if he was being fully honest with himself, deeply attractive. They ate dinner at his desk, because he did not think it was wise to take her to the town's one small eating establishment tonight. He had provisions, basic but adequate, and she had, over the course of the past 3 days, demonstrated that she could cook significantly better than he could, a fact she had noted without condescension, and he had accepted without pride. She made cornbread and reheated the beans he had put on in the morning, and they ate in the lamplight while the evening wind moved outside. "Tell me something about yourself that isn't about the case," she said, somewhere in the middle of dinner. He looked up from his plate. It was a very direct request, and he registered not for the first time that she did not traffic in indirection. "What kind of thing?" "Anything. Where did you grow up? Why did you become a sheriff? What do you do when you're not working?" he thought. "I grew up in Ohio, a town called Galena, which is smaller than Caldwell Springs. My father was a farmer. I came west after the war." He paused. "I don't particularly like talking about the war." "You don't have to." "I became a sheriff because I was a deputy first and the previous sheriff retired and I was the logical person to take the position. And by the time I was in it, I found that I was good at it and that being good at something that matters is about as good a reason as any to keep doing it. And when you're not working," he thought about this more carefully because the honest answer required more care. "I read. I ride for the pleasure of it when there's time. I play chess badly against Tom, who plays chess worse, so neither of us improves. I used to have more time for those things than I do now." He paused again, and then he said it because it was part of the truth, and omitting it felt like a small dishonesty. "I had a wife. She died 4 years ago. Since then the work takes up more of the space." Annie was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said, and she said it with a plainness that did not try to do too much with it, did not reach for consolation or elaboration, just a clean, genuine acknowledgement. He found he was grateful for that. Her name was Clara, he said, which was more than he had intended to say, but once it was said it felt right. She would have been interested in all of this. She had a mind like yours, direct. She didn't like to waste time on things that didn't matter. Annie looked at him, and he could not entirely read her expression, but it was careful and kind. She sounds like someone worth missing. She was. He looked at her for a moment and she looked back, and the lamplight did the thing that lamplight does in small enclosed spaces when two people are being honest with each other, which is to make the whole situation feel both fragile and very real. He cleared his throat and stood to take the plates. She helped without being asked, and they worked in the small space of the office kitchen, and their hands were close on the wash basin for a moment, and neither of them made anything of it, but neither of them moved away particularly quickly. 2 days before the federal marshal was due to arrive, a letter came from Walter Baines, the county attorney, and it was precisely what Roscoe had hoped for. Baines had, in the time since receiving Roscoe's letter, conducted his own preliminary inquiry through channels that did not touch Caldwell Springs, and he had confirmed 2 things. First, that the death certificate for Harlan Delman, known as Boss Delman, had indeed been falsified, and that the man corresponding to that name was believed, on the basis of federal revenue records and a recent land filing under a false name, to be alive and operating in the south of the county. Second, that Chester Crail had not been seen in Caldwell Springs for 4 days, which suggested he was aware that the ledger was gone and had gone to ground. This was both good news and complicated news. Good news because Crail in hiding. Was Crail not actively causing trouble in Caldwell Springs? Complicated news because a man who had gone to ground knew the ground had shifted under him, and men in that position sometimes became reckless. Roscoe told Annie. She read the letter twice, nodded, and said, "So it's almost over. The dangerous part, the legal part, will take time. But I can go back to Caldwell Springs. When the marshal arrives and we've transferred the ledger and your formal statement is taken, yes. There will still be the testimony when it comes to trial, but day-to-day, yes." She was quiet. He thought she might be relieved, and she was, he could see that. But there was something else in her expression, too, and he recognized it because he was feeling a version of it himself. The strange specific reluctance of a person who has been living in a suspended bubble of intense closeness with someone and who knows the bubble is about to end. He did not say this. He was not sure how to say it. She said, late that afternoon, while he was writing up the formal evidence documentation required for the federal transfer, "Roscoe." He looked up. She was standing by the window where she had stood several times over the past days, but her posture was different now, less watchful and more considered. She had her arms folded not in a closed way but in a thinking way. "Yes," he said, "when this is finished and I'm back in Caldwell Springs and you're here doing your work, are we just going to go back to being strangers who exchange 3 sentences at a harvest fair?" He set down his pen. He gave her his full attention, which he understood was the thing she was asking for, not an answer formulated quickly, but a real one. "No," he said, "I don't think that's possible. Because of the case." Not just because of the case. The directness of this appeared to satisfy her, and also to affect her in a way she was managing with her customary precision. She nodded. "Caldwell Springs is 40 miles from here. I've ridden 40 miles before." "I know," she said. "I've done it in the dark." He smiled. It was not something his face did often, which was something she had noticed and which she seemed to find, for reasons he did not fully understand, encouraging rather than discouraging. "I'll come when I can," he said. "And if the school board is amenable, and if you're willing, you might find occasion to come here sometimes." "I think I might," she said. And that was all that needed to be said about that, for the moment, which was enough. The federal deputy marshal arrived on a clear November morning, riding in with a colleague and a federal prosecutor named Gideon Marsh, who had the focused, no-nonsense bearing of a man who has prosecuted a great many cases and does not need to establish himself. His name was Marsh, and he was exactly as his name implied, something steady and fundamental beneath a spare surface. The ledger was transferred formally. with documentation that Roscoe and Marsh reviewed together while Annie sat at the table, and gave her formal statement to the deputy marshal, a meticulous young man named Davies who wrote everything down with the careful hand of someone who understood that every word of this might matter in a court of law. Roscoe watched Annie give her statement from across the room. She was precise and clear, organizing the sequence of events without embellishment or omission, answering questions directly, offering clarification when she saw it was needed. She was excellent at it, and he suspected she would be an equally excellent witness at trial because she had the particular quality of a person who tells the truth without performance, and juries responded to that. Gideon Marsh, reviewing the ledger and the statement together, said to Roscoe, "This is a significant case. You built a foundation for this over 2 years. Most of it was suspicion until Miss Vaughn found that saddlebag." Marsh looked at her across the room. "She showed considerable courage riding through the night alone. She did. And judgment, in bringing it to you rather than attempting to handle it locally. She's a person of good judgment." Marsh gave him a brief, professionally neutral look that was not entirely devoid of personal perception, and returned to his documents. The formal proceedings took the whole morning. When they were done, Marsh told them both that the matter would proceed to a federal grand jury within the month, that subpoenas would be issued for the named individuals in the ledger, and that Chester Crail, whose true identity as Harlan Delman was now being confirmed through the records Baines had gathered, was already the subject of a federal warrant. The capture and arrest was the marshal's office's responsibility and not Roscoe's, though Roscoe would be kept informed. After the federal men had taken the ledger and departed, Roscoe sat in the quiet of his office for a moment and felt the particular deflation that comes after high-stakes effort reaches its first resolution, that odd flatness where you have been running at full capacity for days and suddenly the immediate need for it is past. Annie was standing at the window again, but this time she was looking outward rather than watching for anything, just looking at the wide plain sky. "Ready to go back?" he asked. She turned, yes and no. He understood this completely. He rode with her to Caldwell Springs. He told himself it was sensible, that it was professionally appropriate given the ongoing situation in that town, and both of those things were true. He also told himself the truth, which was that he was not ready to watch her ride away alone. The ride south took the better part of 5 hours at a reasonable pace. They rode mostly side by side when the track allowed it, and sometimes single file when it narrowed, and they talked when they felt like talking and were quiet when they did not. And both of those states were easy in a way that easy things between people rarely just arrive at, that usually have to be built up over much more time than they had had. At one point, late in the afternoon, crossing a shallow creek where the cottonwoods were at their last blaze of October gold, she pulled her horse up beside his and said, simply, "Thank you." "For what specifically?" "For opening your door when every other one was closed, for taking it seriously, for treating me like someone whose account of events was worth trusting." He looked at her in the golden creek light, and the emotion that had been accumulating over 5 days of lamplight and honest conversation and shared meals and careful distance arrived all at once in a wave that he was not inclined to manage with quite the same precision he had managed everything else. "Annie," he said. "Roscoe," she said back, and she was almost smiling, that small quick thing that changed her whole face. "When this is fully resolved," he said, "and your students are settled for the year and the legal proceedings are underway and some ordinary time has passed, I would like to come calling in the proper way if you are agreeable to that." She looked at him for a moment with those brown eyes that had been furious and terrified and sharp and gentle and amused over the past 5 days in a sequence that had done considerable things to his equilibrium. "I am very agreeable to that," she said. They rode on. The sky turned rose and then amber and then a deep October blue, and the lights of Caldwell Springs appeared in the distance, and she looked at them without fear now, with something that was determination and the beginning of something else. They rode into town together, which people noticed. Riding in with the county sheriff was a different thing from arriving alone and frightened in the dark. Doors that had been closed, she noted, were open. The general store was lit. A woman on the boardwalk glanced at them, and then looked away in the particular way of someone who knows they have behaved badly, and has not yet formulated an approach to that knowledge. Roscoe rode with her to the schoolteacher's house and helped her down from the roan, and they stood in the last of the evening light in front of the small porch, and he held her hand one moment longer than a professional farewell required, and she let him, and that was enough. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, she agreed. He rode back north in the dark, and he did not mind the dark at all. The weeks that followed were a time of transformation in Caldwell Springs, the uncomfortable, necessary kind that a place sometimes has to go through to become what it was capable of being. The news of the federal warrants and the ledger and the identity of Chester Crail as the supposedly dead boss Delman moved through the town the way real news moves, fast and unstoppable and complicated. There was shock. There was anger. There was, among the people named in the ledger, a variety of responses ranging from immediate cooperation with federal investigators in hopes of leniency to a stubborn and ultimately ineffective denial. Mayor Hutchins resigned within the week. The town council called an emergency session, and 3 members resigned or were removed. The banker, a man named Aldous Barrick, which was the same Aldous Barrick who had met Annie at the stage on her first day, was arrested on federal conspiracy charges and was held to await trial. The postmaster was removed. The circuit judge recused himself from all matters touching the county and was under investigation by the Judicial Oversight Board. It was, as Roscoe had said, disruptive. But Caldwell Springs, as he had also said, was a town that intended to stay, and it went about the disruption with the same determined practicality it brought to everything else. New council members were elected at an emergency town meeting. A temporary mayor was appointed from among the townspeople who had no connection to the Delman operation. A new town marshal was hired, a man named Garrett who came recommended from a neighboring county and who turned out to be capable and straightforward. Annie went back to her classroom 10 days after returning to town. Her students received her with the mixture of relief and studied nonchalance that children use when they are glad to see someone and do not want to show it too obviously. She taught. She prepared her lessons as she had promised herself she would, carefully and thoughtfully. She opened the windows in the morning to let the autumn air through and set her students to work on their letters and their arithmetic and their geography. And she felt, gradually, that the thing she had come to Caldwell Springs for was still there and still real, that the rotten foundation had been cleared away, and what was left was genuine. She received a letter from Roscoe on the 9th day after they had parted. It was a single page, written in a clean, upright hand that reflected the man exactly, no ornamentation, nothing wasted. It told her the federal proceedings were moving as anticipated, that Crail had been apprehended at a ranch in Barber County to the south, that his true identity as Harlan Delman was confirmed by 2 independent witnesses, and that the trial was expected to begin in the new year. It also said, at the end of the professional summary, in exactly the same calm and deliberate tone as the rest of it, "I am looking forward to the 2 weeks being done. I hope you are well." She read that last sentence 3 times. Then she folded the letter and placed it in the small cedar box on her dresser where she kept things she wanted to keep. She wrote back the next morning, telling him about the changes in town, about the new town marshal, about her students, about the particular October light on the prairie and how it was different from any other month's light and also the best. And at the end, because she was not a person who spoke indirectly when a direct thing could be said, "The 2 weeks are nearly done. I am glad of that." A.V. Roscoe Ellsworth arrived in Caldwell Springs on a Saturday in late October, riding a dark chestnut horse and wearing his good coat rather than the working one, which she noticed, and which told her the kind of thing good coat choices tell you about a person's intentions. He tied the horse in front of the hotel and walked to the schoolteacher's house where she was waiting, because she had known he was coming that day and had deliberately not made other plans. She opened the door before he knocked, because she had seen him coming up the street, and because making him knock when she was already standing at the door had seemed unnecessarily formal. They stood on the porch in the autumn light, and she thought they must look, to anyone walking by, exactly like what they were, two people at the beginning of something standing at the threshold of it. "Miss Vaughn," he said. "Sheriff Ellsworth," she said back, and the careful formality of it made them both smile, hers quick and his slow. "I thought we might walk," he said. "I thought the same thing," she said, and stepped off the porch beside him. They walked the long way around the east end of town, out past the schoolhouse and across the edge of the common where the bay gelding had stood on the October morning that had set everything in motion. The grass was tawny and dry, and the sky was enormous, and the wind was mild and smelled of distance. She told him about her students, the ones who were surprising her and the ones who were requiring infinite patience. He told her about the ongoing case, the legal machinery of it, the parts that were going well and the parts that were moving with the frustrating slowness that complex federal prosecutions required. And they talked about other things, things that had nothing to do with ledgers or saddlebags or corrupt town officials, things that were about them, about who they were underneath the events that had brought them to each other. She told him about her father and the particular shape of the grief she still carried for him, and he told her about Ohio and why he had come west and what he had been looking for when he came, which was something he had not entirely known how to name until recently. She did not ask him to name it. She understood. He stayed in Caldwell Springs for 2 days. On Sunday he attended the church service with her, which was noted by several people, and which she did not mind being noted. After the service, the new temporary mayor, a farmer named Hutchins with no relation to the disgraced previous mayor Hutchins, stopped to speak with them both and to thank Annie publicly for her role in uncovering the corruption, which he did with a simple directness she appreciated. They had dinner at the hotel on Sunday evening, in the dining room, at a proper table with a white cloth, and it was good food and easy conversation and long pauses that were not empty, and she thought, looking at him across the table in the lamplight, that she had not felt this particular feeling in a very long time. It was not the frantic feeling of a new attraction. It was something quieter and deeper than that, more like recognition, like finding that a thing you had been looking for was not as strange as you had expected, but was simply itself, solid and warm and honest. He rode back north on Monday morning, and this time he did not say 2 weeks. He said, "I'll come again as soon as I can." She said, "I'll be here." Both of them understood that these were not casual statements. He came again 3 weeks later. He came on a Sunday in November and this time brought her a book he had ordered from a bookseller in Wichita because she had mentioned in a letter that she had been trying to find a particular collection of essays and could not. She held the book and looked up at him and said, "How did you find it?" He said, "I wrote to the bookseller and asked him to look for it." She said nothing for a moment, and then she went up on her toes and kissed his cheek, which was intended as a brief and somewhat impulsive expression of gratitude, but he had turned slightly at the same moment, and the kiss landed closer to the corner of his mouth than she had intended. They both stood very still for a moment. She stepped back. He looked at her, and his expression was one of the most unguarded things she had seen from him. "I apologize," she said. "That was not quite what I intended." "No," he said after a pause, "I don't think you need to apologize for it." She looked at him for another moment and then laughed. A real laugh, not embarrassment but genuine amusement at the two of them, standing on a November porch being simultaneously very direct and very careful. And he looked at her laughing, and something in him settled into a particular warmth that he thought was probably permanent. He took her hand, which he had not done since the moment they had parted after riding into Caldwell Springs together. She let him take it, and they stood there on the porch while the November wind moved through the cottonwood at the edge of the yard and the afternoon light shifted, and he said quietly, "I do not have a great deal of experience with being wrong about what I feel." "Are you wrong now?" she asked. "No," he said. "Good," she said. "Neither am I." The trial of Harlan Delman, alias Chester Crail, opened in the Federal District Court in Wichita in January of 1884, and it was a thorough and convincing proceeding. Annie testified on the third day, standing in the witness box in her best dress with her hands folded, and her voice clear and steady, walking the court through everything from finding the horse on the common to riding through the dark to the sheriff's office in Garfield County. She answered every question from the prosecutor and the defense with the same precise honesty she brought to everything, and when she left the stand, the prosecutor told her she had been the finest lay witness he had seen in several years, which she received with a modest thanks and a private satisfaction. Roscoe testified the following day, laying out his 2-year investigation with methodical clarity. The ledger, authenticated by 2 document experts, was introduced as Federal Exhibit No. 1, and the jury sat forward in their seats when the clerk read the relevant pages aloud. Harlan Delman was convicted on 7 counts of conspiracy, fraud, bribery of public officials, and filing false death records. He was sentenced to 20 years in the federal penitentiary, and no one in the courtroom appeared to think this was excessive. Chester Crail, as a legal entity, ceased to exist on the day the verdict was read. The men named in the ledger faced a variety of proceedings. The mayor and the council members who had taken bribes were convicted on state charges and removed from public life. The banker Barrick received a federal sentence of 8 years. The circuit judge resigned and was disbarred. The postmaster, who was found to have played a minor role and who had cooperated fully with investigators once it became clear that cooperation was his best option, received a suspended sentence and a significant fine. After the verdicts were returned and the courthouse emptied out into a cold Wichita January, Roscoe found Annie on the courthouse steps, looking out at the gray street with an expression of resolution and relief that was a particular shade of beautiful. He stood beside her. "It's done," he said. "The legal part," she said. "Yes. The rest of it was done a while ago." She turned to look at him, and he thought about the moment she had walked into his office at 2 in the morning with her hair tangled and her hands shaking and something that walked the edge between terror and fury burning in her eyes, and how in that moment, which he had not known enough yet to call the beginning of the rest of his life, she had said, without preamble, in the voice of someone who had found the one door she needed to open, "I need you to look at this." And he had looked and he had seen, and somehow between the seeing and the present moment standing on the courthouse steps in January, the whole direction of things had changed. He said, "Annie." She said, "Ask." He had not precisely formulated it yet in words, but he found that with her the words came out even when they were not fully prepared, which was unusual for him, and which he had decided to take as a sign of something. "I am going to ask you to marry me eventually," he said, "and I want to tell you that now so you have time to consider it, and so that my intentions are clear, because I know that intentions being clear matters to you." She looked at him for a long moment in the cold Wichita January light, and her expression was not surprise, because she was not a person easily surprised, but it was something warm and open and real. "They are clear," she said. "My answer, whenever you ask, will be yes." He reached for her hand and she gave it, and they stood on the courthouse steps while the January wind moved through the city, and the resolution of everything they had been through together settled around them like a different kind of weather, the kind that does not blow over. He did ask. He asked in March, on a Sunday afternoon in Caldwell Springs, in the spring light on her front porch, and her answer was what she had told him it would be, which was yes, without qualification or reservation, yes. They were married in June of 1884 in the church in Caldwell Springs. the one with the white steeple you could see from 2 miles out, before a congregation that included Annie's students and their families, Roscoe's deputy Tom and several of his colleagues, the new mayor of Caldwell Springs and his wife, Gideon Marsh, the federal prosecutor who had become, over the course of the trial, something approaching a friend, and a selection of other people who had come to understand that these two represented something worth attending. The reverend who married them was not the compromised Reverend Poole, who had departed the town some months earlier, but a new minister named Calloway who had a warm and direct manner that Annie liked immediately and Roscoe respected. The service was simple, and the vows were traditional, and when they were done, standing in the June light at the front of the church with Roscoe's hand warm over hers, Annie felt the particular completeness of a thing arrived at through real effort, not handed but earned. They had decided, after extended discussion, and with the kind of honest negotiation that would characterize their life together, that Annie would keep teaching in Caldwell Springs, which she loved and which her students needed, and that Roscoe would maintain the county sheriff's office in Garfield County, which was his responsibility and his vocation, and that the 40 miles between them would be covered on weekends when the work allowed, and that within the year they would find a house approximately equidistant that could serve as the base of a shared life, with Roscoe hiring a deputy capable of handling the week-to-week without his constant presence, and Annie negotiating with the new school board about terms that allowed her more flexibility. It was not the traditional arrangement. It required more of both of them than a simpler setup would have. But they were both people who preferred arrangements that fit reality over ones that fit convention, and the reality was that they had come to each other as fully formed people with work they cared about, and the work was part of who they were, and who they were was what they loved about each other. It seemed important to honor that. They spent their wedding night in the hotel in Caldwell Springs, the same hotel where they had had their first proper dinner together, at the same table in the dining room, and the proprietress, a woman named Cassidy who had the broad, humorous worldview of someone who has seen a great deal of human behavior across a hotel dining room over the years, gave them the best room on the second floor and brought them coffee in the morning without being asked, and wished them long happiness with a sincerity that did not feel like a performance. The first year of their marriage was exactly as complicated and as good as they had expected. Roscoe hired an additional deputy, a steady man named Harrison who was capable and trustworthy, and began spending 3 days a week in Caldwell Springs while maintaining oversight of his office remotely for the first time in his career, which required an adjustment he made with the methodical stubbornness he brought to all adjustments. Annie negotiated a slightly reduced schedule with the school board, which was now composed entirely of people who had not been on any ledger, and used her freed afternoons to begin writing a curriculum document she had been planning for some time, a comprehensive teaching guide for one-room schoolhouses on the southern plains that drew on everything she had learned in 4 years in Wichita and 1 year in Caldwell Springs. They found the house in the spring of 1885, a farmstead halfway between Caldwell Springs and the county seat, on a rise of ground that looked out over the prairie in all directions and had a stand of cottonwoods along the creek line to the east. The house was solid, built by a family that had moved on to Colorado, and it had a big kitchen and good light, and a porch that ran along the south side where the afternoon sun came in level and warm. They bought it in April and spent the spring making it theirs, which involved a great deal of arguing about practical matters like where to put the stove and which room to use for what purpose, and a great deal of laughing, because their arguments, which were real arguments between two people with strong opinions, resolved themselves through the mechanism of each person genuinely interested in the other's reasoning, and this turned out to be a very efficient mechanism. She planted a kitchen garden in the summer, and he built the fence around it, which took him twice as long as he had expected and was not entirely straight, which she noted without cruelty, and he acknowledged with the rueful honesty of a man who has always been better with a horse than with a hammer. Their son was born in the winter of 1886. They named him James, after Annie's father, and he arrived in the world with a large voice and strong opinions about feeding schedules that were entirely his own. And Roscoe sat in the chair by the bed for the first 3 hours of his son's life, with the expression of a man who has been shown something he had no adequate preparation for, something too large to fit inside an ordinary response, and who has consequently stopped attempting an ordinary response, and is just present with the largeness of it. Annie watched him from the bed, tired and aching and more herself than she had ever been, and she thought about the night she had ridden 40 miles through the dark with a ledger in a saddlebag and a heart hammering in her back teeth, looking for one open door in a world of closed ones. She thought about the lamp burning in a window at 2 in the morning. She thought about gray eyes and honest attention, and the sound of a man writing down her words with the care of someone who intended to use them to build something that mattered. She thought about how a single act of finding, of refusing to look away from what she had found, had opened the rest of her life like a door swinging wide on an October morning. James grew. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes and his own particular personality, which was curious and stubborn and affectionate in equal parts, and which both of his parents recognized and also found entirely surprising in the specific way children manage to be both inevitable and unprecedented. He learned to walk on the porch of the farmhouse, and to talk in the big kitchen, and to ride on the front of his father's saddle at an age that made his mother watch with her hands folded and her expression carefully neutral. Roscoe had, by the time James was 2, successfully transitioned his deputy Harrison to the role of acting sheriff for extended periods, maintaining oversight and final authority, but allowing himself the kind of presence at home that a man with a young son and a wife, who was also a person with a full life, required. He was not a man who had ever been good at half measures, and fatherhood was no exception. He was wholly in it. Annie finished her curriculum document and sent it to an educational publisher in St. Louis, who expressed interest in the spring of 1887 and offered to publish it as a practical guide for frontier educators. She sat at the kitchen table and read the letter twice, and then went to find Roscoe, who was repairing a section of the paddock fence with the focused determination of someone who had decided to master carpentry through sheer stubbornness. She handed him the letter. He read it standing in the paddock with sawdust on his coat, and when he finished he looked up at her with an expression she had only seen from him a few times, the one where the internal calm dropped away entirely and what was underneath showed, which was not controlled at all. "Congratulations," he said. "It's just one letter," she said. "It's not just one letter," he said. She knew he was right. The book was published in the fall of 1887, and was received well enough among frontier educators that a second printing was ordered the following year. Annie received letters from teachers across Kansas, Colorado, and the Indian Territory who had found it useful, and she read each of these letters with the satisfaction of a person whose work has landed where it was intended. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1888. They named her Clara, and Roscoe, who had not cried since the day in the winter of 1879 that he would not talk about except with Annie, sat in the chair by the bed for the first hours of this daughter's life with a quiet and complete undoing of composure that he made no attempt to manage. And Annie held his hand and did not say anything, because nothing needed to be said. Clara was, from the earliest evidence, going to be her own particular force of nature, which both of her parents found gratifying and occasionally exhausting. She was loud and certain, and approached the world with an investigative intensity that her mother recognized and her father watched with an expression compounded of amusement and something close to awe. James, who was 3, received his sister with the cautious evaluation of a child who has been an only child and is not yet sure about the revised arrangement, and then, over the course of several weeks, revised his position to something warmer, which his mother watched with the precise pleasure of watching a small person encounter the beginnings of unconditional love. In the years that followed, the prairie farmhouse between Caldwell Springs and the county seat became what houses become when the right people live in them, which is to say it became entirely itself, marked by the particular living of the particular people in it. There were books everywhere, stacked on shelves and on tables and occasionally on the kitchen floor. There was a worn path from the kitchen door to the garden that Annie had expanded over the years to include herbs and flowers alongside the vegetables. There was a schoolroom corner in the east bedroom where Annie tutored students from the surrounding area who needed additional attention, a practice she had started the year James was born, and which had grown to the point where she sometimes had 6 children at a time crammed into the small space, which they did not seem to mind. There was a wall in the front room where Roscoe's law book stood in a row alongside Annie's teaching references and a growing collection of novels and histories, and where Clara's drawings were pinned with tacks from the time she could hold a pencil. Caldwell Springs had rebuilt itself into something cleaner and more genuine than what it had been under the Delman operation. The new authority structure held. The new mayor, who was eventually properly elected, turned out to be a decent and capable administrator. The new marshal kept a competent peace. The school prospered. Roscoe, in his role as county sheriff, maintained the kind of relationship with Caldwell Springs that a working law officer maintains with a town in his jurisdiction, professional and cooperative and occasionally called upon in the middle of the night. And he was regarded there with the respect that had been earned through the events of the fall of 1883, though neither he nor Annie made a point of the history. What they made a point of was the ordinary life, the breakfast table and the evening porch, and the particular texture of long daily closeness with a person who is genuinely interesting to you. They had discovered, in the way that people in good marriages discover it, that the beginning was not the whole of it but only the door, and that what was on the other side of the door was more complex and varied and rich than the beginning had allowed them to see, and that this was not a disappointment but was in fact the whole point. They argued about things, because they were both people with strong opinions, and their arguments were productive in the particular way that arguments are productive when the underlying intention of both parties is mutual understanding rather than victory. They surprised each other regularly in the way that people who pay genuine attention to each other continue to surprise each other over time because people are not finished. They were not finished. They kept becoming. On a Saturday afternoon in October of 1890, exactly 7 years after the morning that Annie Vaughn had found a bay gelding standing at the edge of a common in Caldwell Springs with a saddlebag working itself loose in the early light, she sat on the south porch of the farmhouse with a cup of coffee and watched Roscoe come up from the paddock with James, who was 4 and who had decided that Saturday morning paddock work was a preferred activity. Walking beside him with his small, serious face turned up toward his father's, asking questions that Roscoe was answering with the same straightforward thoughtfulness he had always brought to questions that deserved thoughtful answers. Clara was inside, asleep. The kitchen smelled of the bread Annie had baked in the morning, which was still warm on the counter. The prairie stretched out in every direction in the October light, enormous and breathing and honest, the same light that fell on it now as had always fallen on it, the light that some people found lonely and Annie had always found truthful. Roscoe came up the porch steps with James behind him, and he looked at Annie sitting with her coffee in the afternoon light, and she looked at him, and they had the particular exchange that people have after many years of looking at each other with attention, which conveys a great deal without requiring a word. He sat down beside her. James climbed into the chair on her other side and announced that he wanted bread, which she told him to go cut a piece from the loaf in the kitchen, and he went with the purposeful directness of a small person who has been told a thing he wanted to hear. The screen door closed behind him. The afternoon light moved across the porch. "Are you happy?" Roscoe asked. It was not a question he asked often, which was why she answered it each time with the full weight it deserved. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. Yes, she said, in the real way, the complicated, whole, actual way. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had taken it on the courthouse steps in Wichita in January of 1884. The same hand, the same warmth, and the years between then and now were not an abstraction but a weight she could feel in the best possible sense, like the specific gravity of something built to last. "Good," he said. Inside, James was cutting bread with more enthusiasm than precision, and Clara would wake up any minute and make her entrance into the afternoon with her characteristic volume, and the October light was doing exactly what October light on the southern plains does, which is to be the most beautiful and honest light in the world, falling on a woman who had once been closed out of every door in town until she found the one that opened, and on the man whose door it had been, and on the house that was theirs, and on the wide and generous and indifferent and entirely real prairie that surrounded them all. Every door that mattered was open now. And the one that had opened everything stood 7 years behind them, wide and shining in memory, the hinge that had turned the rest of their lives from what they might have been toward what they were, which was more than either of them could have asked for, and exactly as much as both of them had earned.